something like the pandemic, you can plan as much as you like. I'm sure all of us have business continuity plans, pandemic plans. But I think most of us were caught unawares of the impact of this. So again, be realistic as to what you can really expect your supplier to do. Ensure that the training is provided to both your own and the supplier's staff as to what the process is and what is expected. Training has to be ongoing. We all have a turnover of staff within our businesses, as do the suppliers. So you need to make certain that new starters do know what they need to do. But obviously, as you'll need to change or practices change, you need to review that training that you give the staff to see whether it does need to change. And something that we've introduced is some staff swaps. We've found that our staff always think that the supplier has an easy life, and the supplier staff always think that we have an easy life. So just by exchanging some key staff a few times a year, or half a day, it means that those staff in both organisations have a better understanding. Early supplier involvement, as I said before, try and involve your suppliers as soon as you can. Spikes can occur in business as usual, and also you may have new projects. So for example, we've got 500 new homes opening in June 21, and we've got another 500 homes opening in January 22. All of those need to be furnished, and although that may seem a long way away, we're already doing the planning. We're already engaging with our key suppliers to make certain that they can scale up to ensure that they can deliver our products on time. Monitoring hidden risks such as financial strength, something I would certainly recommend that everyone does at the moment, particularly with the economic situation. And these tools are readily available on the marketplace, and they are relatively inexpensive. So you don't necessarily have to monitor the financial status of every supplier, but certainly tier your suppliers to see which are your key ones and which will have an impact on your business. It may be on an operational basis, regulatory basis, financial basis, and decide based on that triage of the impact they'll have, which ones you need to financially monitor. Risk and reward pricing mechanisms. Certainly within the financial services sector where I used to work, these were relatively commonplace, not so commonplace elsewhere. And I have found that these are probably the best way to drive the performance with your suppliers. Okay, if they know that if they're going to get a really good, they're going to get more money if they do a really good job, that is going to drive them to do that really good job. And similarly, if they know that there is going to be a penalty, which mustn't be punitive, it has to be reasonable, it will focus their minds. Clear contractual obligations with precise specifications and relevant service levels. You need to get that right, and don't feel that once you put that in place, there's something that can't be changed to the end of the contract. Constantly review them to check that they are appropriate, they are suitable. Don't measure things just for the sake of measuring something if it isn't actually going to have any impact on you or on your customer base. Remember that service and quality do come at a price. Often tenders are received where I think you know that the supplier cannot really perform at those costs. I know that everyone is driven to make savings wherever possible, but you have to be realistic. A recent experience we had is we have large landscaping contracts across our developments. Two of them are by the same landscaping company in a similar geographical location, so it's not necessarily different staff doing it, and they were performing perfectly adequately at one but underperforming at another. And when I looked into what we were expecting them to do and what we were paying them, it just wasn't realistic for us to expect them to do everything they needed to do to keep that landscaping to the standard that we required for our residents. And do try to enter into long-term relationships that the supplier will be prepared to invest both time, money, and resource. Where possible, try to move away from transactional relationships. All of our standard contract length now is 3 years. Okay. Previously, we tended to enter into 1-year contracts or just standard PO terms. So although we might have been spending hundreds of thousands of pounds with that supplier, they had no surety that they would get any business next month or later in the year. So every time that we placed an order, it was viewed by the supplier as if it may be their last order. So they were giving focus to the customer, to the clients that have committed to them and that they know that they're going to have a long-term relationship. And since we introduced the standard 3-year contract, just by doing that and showing to our supply chain, we do see them as strategic partners. We've seen a significant improvement in performance across those suppliers. How do you put things right? Easier said than done. First, you've got to understand what the problem is. Be objective. There are always two sides to the story. And as I said earlier, don't assume that the supplier is doing everything wrong and that you're doing everything right. You need to work with your supplier to complete that root cause analysis. Problems will sit almost certainly within both organisations, and you need to give equal focus to every step in the process. Agree a clear plan with actions on both sides, and you do need to drive that through, the action on both sides. Certainly in my experience, where the customer may be at fault, the supplier has sometimes been a little bit reticent to point that out and say what needs to be done. And you do need to have that relationship with your suppliers so that they feel confident in speaking honestly and openly to you. And that just as you expect them to commit to a rectification program, that if you are causing part of that problem, that you commit to that rectification program within your own organisation. Can you release pressure on the supplier by flexing another panel member? Or can certain service levels be relaxed while remediation works are going on? Again, easier to do in services rather than in product. But you certainly can try to tier your suppliers. You have your tier 1 that you go to for the majority of the product, tier 2 as a supplementary or overflow supplier. But you may have to accept that you will pay more if you go to the tier 2. But the cost of paying more for the tier 2 may be well below the impact on your business if production ceases or service ceases because you run out of the services or the product that you need. Update the contract to reflect any changes. The contract is really a living document. It's not something that you sign off on day 1, contract starts, you put it in a cupboard and don't think about it again unless there's a problem or until it comes to renewal. You need to review those contracts annually, okay, just to check that they are still fit for purpose, okay, and also that they are actually compliant from a regulatory basis. A lot of companies were caught out when the GDPR regulations came into force and found out that their existing contracts were not only not compliant with the new legislation, but weren't compliant with the old legislation because they hadn't been appropriately updated when it was last updated. And one of the improvements and one of the performance to ensure that improvements are not temporary, I'm sure that we've all seen the performance curve where the supplier gets awarded the contract, performs very well at the beginning, midway through the contract there's a dip, maybe a little bit of complacency, and then towards the end of the contract they suddenly think, oh, we might lose this contract, and then suddenly their focus comes back on you and the performance suddenly improves. So do monitor that performance throughout the entire life cycle of their contracts, which I know is easier said than done. But I think if you do put some of the things in place that I've already suggested, it should make some of those peaks and troughs less significant. Now, there are obviously instances where the performance is not adequately addressed. It's therefore the case that the contract will need to be terminated. So I would always suggest that if it's a key strategic supplier, you should always include within the contract an agreed exit strategy. And that will ensure a smooth transition to the new supplier. And it will actually be to the benefit not only of you and your colleagues, but actually make it an easier transition process for the supplier and their staff. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully you've found that useful. I will stop sharing and mute myself and hand back to Dan.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was really informative, and there's been a lot of activity on the questions, but due to time, what I'm going to do is hold all the questions specific to your presentation, and we'll do it all at the end, and we'll go through all the questions. So now what I'd like to do is hand over to Sam Rose. So over to you, Sam. Do you want to make yourself?
Hi, thank you. Hello, hopefully you can all see my slides. I'm Sam Rose, I'm the head of procurement at Tails.com. I have brought with me today over 11 years experience, so hopefully I can shed some light on what we do at Tails around what makes a successful negotiation. What do I mean by that? Every day, so think about your negotiations as time and not just value. Well, we believe that each interaction should be, whether planned or unplanned, is an opportunity to really influence the other party. So invest in building rapport, invest in building relationships, invest in building trust. And at Tails, we build trust through connectedness, credibility, and consistency. The key watch-outs here are: don't let your personal agenda destroy a successful outcome of that relationship. Preparation and planning. What do I mean by that? They say that a successful negotiation, 90% of that negotiation should be about the planning, which is a big chunk of your time. So preparation is really key to your success and your outcome. Outline all your internal objectives with your team and what those desired outcomes are going to be. Do some scenario planning as well. I think this is really helpful in helping us kind of navigate the alternative things that might happen during those negotiations. Outline their objectives. This one's really important. So what do we believe the other party want to achieve? And what are their desired outcomes in our opinions and what we know about them? And really, really important here, let's not assume they remain the same pre-2020. A lot's changed this year with the global pandemic and Brexit almost here. Align all the objectives with the negotiation party and the approval party internally. That one's really important. And actually, that's one of the reasons why negotiations can really fail, is that the internal party, you've done all your hard work, and the people that are approving it internally haven't agreed on that. And finally, creating value. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take this apple. So if we have an apple and we have our negotiation, what we could do, what sometimes happens, is you cut that apple in half. Both parties walk away with half that apple. Some call this a kind of a win-win situation, or we've both achieved halfway here. We walk away happy. But actually, we both walk away and we go, well, I've got half of an apple, half the skin, half the flesh, half the stalk. This is not really what I wanted. It's not really down to the interest of where I started, what I wanted from this. The other party probably feel the same. So another way of exploring this is to understand really what the other party wanted, because it turns out we wanted the flesh of that apple, and the other party wanted all the skin around the outside. So had we identified that earlier on, both parties could have achieved 100% of what they wanted. So how do we go about creating value and thinking about that? Creating value for both parties in negotiation is understanding the other party's interest. So remember the apple. Identify the shape and the depth of that negotiation. So what's the longevity required for this relationship? What's the dependency we have on them in the business? What are the variables we're going to be negotiating? And what's the trust required to make this a successful negotiation? Actively keep them invested. So keep talking, keep actively, being involved with them and discussing the topic. And business as usual as well. Keep them really engaged. Finally, build an information plan. And I love this one. We call them our information nuggets at Tails, and this is what we trade. These are great pieces of information that are actually things that you can add to your negotiation, things that are going to be really beneficial to the other party. That's short and sweet, and that's my tips on successful negotiation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam. The questions keep coming through, so at the end we'll go through them all. So now if I'd like to hand over to Chris. Dave, you turn your mic off.
Hello Dan, thank you very much for the introduction. A little bit about me. So I'm currently Head of Procurement at Church of England based in Westminster in London. Prior to that, I spent 15 years at a major UK sight loss charity. I noticed that one of my colleagues from there is on the call today. Thanks for joining that. Prior to that, I spent 19 years in the aerospace and engineering world in a local company in Cambridge, in England. And I think the experience that's come through from all of those for me is about the detail in bits and pieces, and that really resonates with some of the panelists. So I'll share my screen now, and I will talk you through my element of the presentation. So I'm talking about contract management and how we mitigate risk. So Church of England, by its very nature, is a very old and historic organisation, and unfortunately, a lot of the organisation tended to do things in an old and historic way. It became very clear, and I joined Church of England in 2017, it became very clear that they wanted a new approach. And basically, they wanted to challenge the norm that we had there because it was such an old and traditional organisation. So we had to try and understand whether the way that we were working was effective. Should we challenge that norm, our way of working, and actually change our approach into finding and undertaking better ways of working as an organisation? Unsurprisingly, I would hope, they decided that we needed to create a more effective and collaborative approach to not only procurement and finance, but also to how we manage our contracts post-award. What has been really, really refreshing from this is that departments are now very much aware of who those central teams are. It has allowed us to put in joined up thinking and joined up working. People are aware of what the central teams do, what our processes are, and more importantly, the best practice approach that really they should follow to achieve the right outcome from awarding the contract. And what is important, and some of the others have mentioned this before, I think Nick mentioned this earlier on, it's about, once it's been awarded, not just putting it in a drawer. We manage our contracts now upstream and downstream. We are at a very early stage of this, but it has worked in a few areas that we started to do this. So we ensure that our service delivery is looked at and that is delivered in accordance with the agreed performance and quality levels that go.
Now is I'll start going through some of the questions we had. I'll try and do it in an order. So the first set will hopefully be targeted at Nick about poor performing suppliers. Then we have Sam on negotiation, and then Chris on robust contract management put in place. As I said at the very start of the call, obviously these are just aspects of contract management. If there is any other questions you have in regards to contract management generally, please do use the Q&A function. So the first question we received is for Nick, and it's, how do you evaluate a supplier's financial standing, and what are the parameters used? Would it be the same or different for the supply of goods, works and services?
Yes, it would be different. We certainly don't relate it to whether it's goods or services. What we do is we look at the impacts that the failure of that supplier would have on us as a business. Okay, So we look at the impact on our residents, the impact on us financially, the impact on us as an organisation, and the impact on us from a regulatory basis. And therefore, based on a scoring based on those impacts, we then tier them as to, okay, this needs to meet X minimum financial stability, this needs to meet Y, okay? So it's related to the impact on us as a business rather than the actual, this is for goods, this is for services. In terms of the monitoring, we use tools such as Experian, which is one of the most commonly used from my experience. I have worked for companies where we have had blanket rules regarding the company has to have been trading for a certain period of time before we will engage with them. That does not help develop people and businesses if you just say, well, you've got to trade for 2 years before you can trade with us. So certainly where I'm at the moment, we don't impose that rule, but I have had that at other companies.
Okay, and following on from that, I suppose I have a question that could be to yourself and all the panelists. I suppose the worry we've had now with COVID and Brexit looming and companies really under pressure, actually financial standards are really hard to assess at the moment, because usually the data's backward facing 12 months. So it'd be really interesting to hear how your companies have decided to mitigate that going forward, and how I know there's been talk of forecasting, which is not a great way of doing it, but have you put any mitigations in place to try and combat the risk of a supplier going into administration?
Is there anyone in particular?
Yeah, anyone?
Okay. If I start, we try to have an open dialogue with our suppliers, and obviously we do monitor their performance very, very closely. So even though the financial data is not 100% up to date, you can usually, if you're monitoring the supplier's performance, you're monitoring the right things, you can usually start to see a downward trend in the performance of that supplier, because if they get into financial difficulty, then there will be. They're not going to perform brilliantly and then just disappear. There will be a downward slope in terms of performance.
Okay, so moving on, the next question or observation is quite a good one, and I suppose I just want your thoughts on this, Nick. The performance of a supplier is not always part of the award process. Also, the responsibility of contract management can be blurred or forgotten. So have you got any advice in that area?
The performance, when you are selecting your new supplier, you need to create a framework in whatever documentation you send out, where you can ask the probing questions as to what you need them to do and how they will achieve it. And you will need to drill down into what would normally be deemed as punitive, the unenforceable.
Thank you. It's got a couple more questions for Nick, and then give Nick a breather. So there's two questions here, but they're quite similar. So we've got, have you got any numbers for the change to the 3-year contract savings and better value achieved, for example? And then again, a similar question: why and how did you agree a 3-year standard contract length?
Okay. In terms of the savings were not significant as a result of changing to a 3-year contract. They range from 5 to 15%. Where we've seen the significant improvement is on the service and the quality that we get, because we are, as a long-term customer, we're regarded as more important. So there's more focus on us than there was before. Okay. And so, and the other part of the question was?
Why and how did you agree a 3-year standard contract length?
3 years. That was actually an internal discussion and external. So we discussed with our suppliers as to what they wanted from us and what they needed for them to commit, time resource money to us. Obviously, they came up with some very long contracts that they would like, which obviously we scaled back. But internally, we also looked at what would it cost to us as a business in, tendering things. Was there any benefit in us tendering, on a more regular basis? There is a cost to tendering. There is a cost to changing a supplier. Okay, so don't just do it for the sake of it. Okay, and we felt that 3 years wasn't a particularly arbitrary number. It was reasonable for them to commit to the service and for us to be able to forward plan so that we could properly review it when the contract came up for its renewal.
Okay, and was that the standard even on an IT contract, say, which could be a big infrastructure IT project? Would 3 years be changed then? Would you adapt it then?
The IT contracts tend to be either 3 years or 5 years. I did have one the other day where they wanted us to sign for 10 years, and I went, that's not happening. We can usually agree 5. 3 can be problematic for us, but if you persevere, there's a good chance of you getting it.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think for now that's the bulk of your questions done, so thank you.